Okay. Hello! I'm Payne the Doll, or just Payne. This is. I've re recorded so often. This is unscripted, and this is just kind of like an analysis of Michael Yu. This was going to be one of Luke, but I realized I probably just don't have the energy to go through the chaos that is Luke Castellan. And having like a general Michael Yu analysis is a lot easier because he's in one book. I mean, technically you could say he's in like mention in two, but for most part, he's in one book, most of his scenes, and then he's like barely in the full book. So it's pretty easy to do analysis. This is probably still going to be a long video because I have many thoughts on Michael Yu, and you guys are going to hear all of them. Anyway, for those who don't know, either you haven't read the book in a while, or you just haven't read them at all, which, you know what, I'm not to judge. If you're here listening, go off. Michael Yu is a a minor character in The Last Olympian. He is the head counselor of the Apollo cabin. He replaced Lee Fletcher, who died in the book prior. He dies in this same book. It's like a running trend of, Apollo head counselors just die. And he's the reason this starts, because he dies exactly after Lee Fletcher dies in the book prior. So, there's not much on Michael Yu. He's he's a minor character. He's so minor that, like, he gets no notice after he falls. And he doesn't even really, we assume he dies. But his death is never confirmed. Which is weird to say, because, like, he's treated like he's dead. So we can assume he might be dead, but we don't know if he's assumed dead, or if they actually know he's dead. It's never really confirmed, and it's a mess. But anyone who's a fan of Michael Yu knows that we live in denial. That maybe, just maybe, it's a bad denial. But Michael Yu is he's introduced arguing with Clarice LaRue, who is the head counselor of the Ares cabin and has been since assumably before the books began, of course. And his introduction, Percy describes him as 4'6" with another 2 feet of attitude. And that's about right. He's a very, he has attitude. And not in the same way Clarice does. And I think this is a reason I kind of want to do a video on him. I've rambled about his character so much on Tumblr. It's kind of sad. He's definitely a favorite character. But a lot of things when I think about him is just the comparison between him and Clarice LaRue. Obviously, they're butting heads throughout, mainly the start of the book. Once you get into the Battle of Manhattan, it's forgotten. It's just forgotten. It's hardly mentioned after, all that. And it's interesting, though, because it's just seeing the character back and forth. And what, the comparison to Michael Yu versus Clarice and how they handle things is interesting. From the point of, even looking at why they're arguing in the first place. The reason Michael Yu and Clarice are arguing is that during a battle or skirmish, the Apollo cabin captured a flying chariot. Well, the Ares cabin was apparently leading that battle. I don't know how that works, by the way. I don't know, because there's 2 head counselors, obviously, because 2 cabins. I don't know how they choose who leads the battle. per se. I'm not sure what the planning there is, but Clarice was leading that battle, so she thinks her cabin should have it. Of course, Michael is like, no, my cabin was the one who did the work to get it, so it's ours. And everyone agrees with him. No one really agrees with Clarice in here. It's made very clear Clarice is the one being a brat about it. And Michael is just kind of like a set piece to show that. But it's interesting looking into the argument because, you know, Percy comes in and they're going back and forth. And the first line, of course, we hear from Michael is, "It's our loot," he yelled, standing on his tiptoes so he could get into Clary's face. "If you don't like it, you can kiss my quiver." And that's like the first thing we hear from him. And it's also one of my favorite lines. It's very funny in context. Like, it's very clear he wanted to say something else. As you go in, of course, Percy immediately's like, "Stop it. What are you doing?" And Clarice goes, "Tell Michael not to be a selfish jerk." "Oh, that's perfect coming from you," Michael said. And it's very interesting reading through that start when we know how Michael ends up being. I wanted to bring this scene up, obviously, because this is an introduction, but also the, you know, tell Michael not to be a selfish jerk. That's perfect coming from you, because it hits kind of hard to me, because Michael is not really that selfish of a character. Like, he doesn't get much scenes, of course, but when you look through all his scenes, he's not that selfish of a character. Like, obviously he's fighting for the chariot, but like, that chariot is rightfully his. Now, do I think there could have been a compromise? Probably. Maybe, but let's be honest. Who's going to benefit more from a flying chariot? The, you know, Ares cabin, who obviously has a mix of weapons and uses but usually is known for their close combat, or the Apollo cabin, who is known for their range combat. So, like, even logically, the Apollo cabin having the chariot makes the most sense. And of course, Clarice is... We learned from Pollux that apparently Clarice had been refusing to even speak to anyone until it's resolved. It's very funny, Travis being like, "It's been wonderful." They're very funny about this, but Clarice has been having a full, like, hissy fit about this chariot. And it's clear that, like, from how everyone talks, this is mainly a Clarice issue. Because Michael is just kind of there, and he doesn't seem like he's mainly just standing his ground for most of it. Obviously, there's, like, you know, you see the Apollo cabin going ham in the, like, against the Ares cabin, but, like, when it comes to, like, reaction, it seems like he's just defending what he sees. Obviously, it's his cabin, and, you know, he's very defensive of his cabin, and we see this throughout the book. And then, with the rest of the scene, Clarice turns to Curon and is like, "Does my cabin get what we want or not?" And Curon's like, "Michael is correct. The Apollo cabin has the best claims. Besides, we have more important matters." And Clarice is like, "Always more important than what Ares cabin needs." And it's like, honey, you are in the middle of a war. And we also have, obviously, Clarice then turns to the other head counselors and are like trying to get them, are any on my side? And none of them, you know, respond. And then she just leaves. And the whole time, Michael, until she leaves, Michael's just quiet. He doesn't, drag anyone else. He doesn't make an argument. He's just quiet and lets it go. And then when she leaves, he's like, good riddance. And Katie's like, this is a disaster. And, like, it's, like, very clear, obviously, Clarice is just throws a fit and leaves. And Michael doesn't say a word outside of, like, that first, couple lines. So it's like a lot of it is Clarice being reactionary and Michael just meeting her, at that point. Then, of course, we get to the Great Prophecy, blah, blah, blah. And Michael, again, he doesn't bring up the cherry and all that. And obviously, I think because he knows there's no reason to argue about it because Clarice is gone. But he goes into business, like, immediately. He doesn't say hardly anything. Percy talks through Jake Mason, is the one to, like, talk about the idea of this sword being the cursed blade and all, or the scythe being the cursed blade and all that. And then we get to when Percy finally mentions that they have a spy. And Michael Yu is the first one to react. Let's move on, I said. We got other problems. We got a spy. Michael Yu Scout. A spy? And which is an interesting play to me because one, Michael Yu's, like, fall, his death is partially caused by the spy. Of course, like, we know that the spy is Selena in this case. I'm sorry if this is spoilers. But, we know the spy is Selena, of course, and, her being able to tell where they were during the Battle of Manhattan is probably the reason, Kronos goes to where he goes. And I'm going to get into that later when we get to that part. But, I just wanted to point out Michael Yu being immediately, like, a spy. Then they start, back and forth. There's, like, a short part where, subconsciously Connor accidentally looks at Annabeth when they're talking about it and immediately looks away. Then Katie just goes for the throw. This is not Michael Yu related. Every time I read this, her, like, because Connor just subconsciously looks at Annabeth when he's thinking about who the spy could be. Oh, they're probably someone, he knew well. And then Katie is just, like, mad over those chocolate Easter bunnies, I guess, and goes, like, one of Luke's siblings. And, which is, one, okay, did have to go through for the throat right there. Two, even worse, when we know about Chris being, previously, just came back, was in a state of insanity. This is nothing Michael related. I'm sorry, I went off topic, but I had to just bring that up. Moving on. They continue talking about it. Selena gets upset. Obviously she's upset over, guilt and all that. And then, Pollux, speaks up after, she gets upset. Pollux, my man. Pollux and Michael afterwards. She's right, Pollux said at last. Accusing each other doesn't help. We need to keep our eyes open for a silver necklace with his scythe charm. If Kronos had one, the spy probably does too. Michael Yu grunted. We need to find the spy before we plan our next operation. Blowing up the Princess Andromeda won't last forever. So, again, Michael Yu being like, we have to deal with this spy makes the fact that, yeah, he was right, because the spy was kind of the reason he ended up in the situation where he kind of, I'm going to say died. I don't, his death is not fully confirmed, but let's be honest, he's probably dead. He did really kind of die because of everything going on with the spy. So him bringing up is interesting. It's also just interesting seeing him, obviously, I love reading these scenes, by the way, when the head counselors are working and talking together, and you see, like, the different thoughts of each character. And we got something like this with Lee Fletcher. Actually, that's one of the few scenes we have of Lee Fletcher, Michael Yu's predecessor. It's that he's the first, like, when they're talking about the labyrinth and what to do, he's the first to go, we set up defense. He's, knowing that, of course, he's also the one who chased away a dragon in the Battle Labyrinth. And it's very interesting because, like, there's this idea of, and people treat Will the same way, of Apollo kids being chill, like surfer dude almost sometimes, when really they are so, like, battle mind. And this is something they get from their dad. Like, Apollo is, canonically in myth especially, just can be terrible to go against. You do not want Apollo on the enemy side. He's, he makes a whole army sick for the sake of a daughter of one of his priests being returned and all that. And, the reason for his beef with Achilles especially and all that. It's very interesting to me. And I think that's also why I love Michael, because he's a good example of what Apollo child probably would be. He's not chill and relaxed and surfer do mode or whatever people portray Apollo as. He's like, he has attitude. He's not like Clarice level attitude, but he has his own attitude. But he also knows when to be chill. And it's very interesting of a character. The next small scene we get in Michael is him in the chariot dive bombing a Ares camper. It's very funny. The Ares camper tries to stab him and is cursing him out and rhyming couplets. Also, yeah, Apollo kids can have you curse you to only speak in rhymes and stuff like that, like poetry wise. And I love it. It's very funny. Actually, this small scene of Percy watching the Apollo and Ares cabin going back and forth. There's one thing I've seen that people don't talk about, and again, not Michael Yu related, but I have to bring it up. The Ares cabin can, like, turns the arrow tips into harmless rubber. Like, you see that described, and it's like, they can just make your weapon, like, not work. That is something that should have been explored more. It's in this one scene. I don't think we ever see it anywhere else. And I'm so upset. Because it's so cool. The Ares cabin gets such a lowdown. Moving on. So, after that, the next time we see Michael is him coming up to Manhattan with the rest of the head counts and the rest of camp outside the Ares cabin. When they go up into Olympus. And they're, walking through it and seeing, everything that's going on. And of course there's a small part of Percy and Annabeth talking, and then Pollux points out something. I'm going to read the passage. "Look," Pollux cried, pointing towards the horizon. "What is that?" We all froze. Blue lights were streaking across the evening sky towards Olympus like tiny comets. They seemed to be coming from all over the city, heading straight towards the mountain. As they got close, they fizzled out. We watched them for several minutes, and they didn't seem to do any damage, but still, it was strange. Like infrared scopes, Michael Yu muttered. We're being targeted. So, it's again, small thing, him immediately noticing, like, infrared scopes. I just like seeing, and that's something that, again, I love about Michael. He seems very smart, and he's very much a strategist, I feel like. He points out a lot of stuff to Percy, and you can tell he takes in a lot of his surroundings. Because you have, obviously, this scene where he immediately goes, we're being targeted, infrared scopes. And it's again, one sentence, but I feel like it just, like, shows a bit of how his mind works in battle. And then, of course, everyone else, continues on, going through. Hestia just outs Percy on having the curse of the Achilles. It's never talked about, but it assumed because of that, most people probably knew about Percy's curse of Achilles without him even saying anything, because Hestia just outs him. I don't know how important that is for Michael. I just wanted to point it out. At one point, Hestia does something. Percy passes out. Everyone is looking at him like, dude, you okay? And he's like, I gotta focus. Hermes shows up, blah, blah, blah. Okay, we get through the talk with Hermes, and then Connor runs, both Stoll brothers run in. I always thought it was just Connor for some reason. I don't know why. Connor runs in. The blue lights have stopped, but everything has stopped, because obviously they put Manhattan to sleep. And immediately, Percy gets upset, and he pushes Michael Yu out of the way and looks at his binoculars. He just pushes Michael Yu, and Michael Yu doesn't say a word. And I feel like this is important to say, because, like, Michael Yu is, like, represented as a very angry, small gremlin by most of the fandom. And for a big part of that, that's true. But I also feel like people don't realize this boy has so much patience. The whole time, like, I'm reading through, like, in Battle of Manhattan at least, he has so much little patience during battle. And he's very, like, he knows when to get angry and when not to. And again, I'll explore that a little more later on. But it's very interesting to me. Percy just shoves Michael, and Michael is just unfazed. Either that, or he just doesn't bring it up that Michael reacted. It could be anything. But, we go back through, they return from Olympus. They're discussing what to do. They're giving everyone, orders and stuff like that. And Michael Yu is the one to point out they have boats. And Percy's like, I'll deal with the boats. And Michael's like, how? This becomes a trend. Percy's so good at, I got this, and not telling Michael anything. And of course, he has Michael take Wilson Burbridge with the rest of his cabin. They continue on discussing about it. And of course, then they, head out for battle. And then, of course, the next time we get to Michael Yu is going to the bridge. Our first introduction, getting to the bridge, we immediately see that the Apollo campers are retreating. They're, using explosive arrows. They're dropping, caltrops. They're, building barricades, and they're dragging sleeping drivers out of their cars to get them out of harm's way. Like, they are focused on, and that's an interesting part, they are focused on getting, mortals out of harm just as much as fighting. And, like, they have a whole, like, army they are facing. They are facing the Minotaur, they are facing a whole army of monsters. And hellhounds are leaping, from time to time, and just, we see one get a hold of Apollo Camper and just drag him away. We can assume that, obviously, he's probably dead. And that's, like, our big introduction to how the Apollo Cabin is, taking on their battle. Percy and Annabeth land, and Michael Yu runs up to them. And I'm going to read this bit of it. Michael Yu ran up to us. He definitely was the shortest commando I'd ever seen. He had a bandage cut on his arm, his ferrety face was smeared with soot, and his quiver was almost empty, but he was smiling like he was having a great time. Glad you could join us, he said. Where are the other reinforcements? For now, we're it, I said. Then we're dead, he said. You still have your flying chariot? Annabeth asked. Nah, Michael said. I left it at camp. I told Clary she could have it. Whatever, Not worth fighting about it anymore. But she said it was too late. We insulted her honor for last time or some stupid thing. At least you tried, I said. Michael shrugged. Yeah, well, I called her some names when she said she still wanted to fight. I doubt that helps. Here comes the uglies. He drew an arrow and launched it towards the enemy. The arrow made a screaming sound as it flew. When it landed, it unleashed a blast like a power chord on an electric guitar magnified through the world's largest speakers. The nearest cars exploded. Monsters dropped the weapons and clasped their ears in pain. Some ran, others disintegrated on the spot. That was my last sonic arrow, Michael said. A gift from your dad? I asked. Got a music? Michael grinned wickedly. Loud music can be bad for you, unfortunately. It doesn't always kill. So this, like, obviously introduction to him during the battle. One, he is grinning. I kind of love, like, the introduction to him in battle is that he's keeping a strong face, because I'm sure he is very much worried. He's, focused on battle. He's losing his siblings, but he is grinning. And, he's focused on the battle. He's focused on getting it done. But I think one thing, obviously, and obviously when he learns that it's just Percy and Annabeth, he immediately is like, well, we're dead. And it's very funny. I love his kind of, like, personality in this. Is that, well, we're dead. And he's so blunt. I think that's a lot with his character is he's blunt. He tells it like he is. Which makes sense. He is the son of the god of truth. Apollo is known for being the god of truth. And I can assume his children are, his children are blunt. Will has a lot of blunt moments too. They're not good at, sugarcoating or lying. It's not that they can't lie. They can. They're just bad at it. And the same with Apollo too. In like Trust Apollo, he's just bad at lying. He'll lie, but he's bad at it. he's very cringy about it and stuff like that. So it's very interesting having Michael, who is, just blunt. He's blunt, and I love it. Of course, we also get, Annabeth asking about the chariot, and Michael just doesn't care. He's not, like, mad when he talks about it. He has his whatever attitude, he's like, left at camp, told Clary she could have it. And when she, still won't fight, he doesn't mention about fighting to have it back. He just gives up. He doesn't care. And I think this is one thing I think about a lot when it comes to Michael versus Clarice. That Clarice is throwing such a big fit over this chariot. she doesn't care what happens to, everyone else in the battle. She's putting, her honor and pride over everything else. And it's ironic because she's the daughter of the god of war, and she's putting, she's backing away from war. And to me, it always also came out of, like, there's a lot going on. She's probably scared of losing those in her cabin. She doesn't know, the battles are different than what she probably thought war was going to look like, and she's trying to seem strong. She's trying to, hold some, power and stuff like that. And the Ares cabin is disrespected a lot. I will give her that. They are disrespected a lot. But a lot of it, too, is just she's being a brat. She's throwing a fit. And with Michael, he's just kind of meeting her where she's at. He's making sure he's not being pushed over. And for Michael, it's even more severe. And I talked about it again on Tumblr before. But Clarice is someone who grew up with the idea of war being honorable, being for glory. She has this view of, the same way, obviously, like with Achilles and all the other heroes had, where it's something you'll be recognized for, and, it's something honorable, and big and all this. But Michael doesn't really have that point of view. Obviously he's protecting the chariot because that's what his cabin fought for. But Michael is a healer. We learn that he's the one who trained Will and all that. So he's a healer. He's seen, front and center what war really does. It kills. It can kill fast. It can kill slow. It's brutal. So Michael has this, obviously view of war being for a cause. He's still fighting this because he has a cause to protect those he loves. Clarice, obviously, she does want to protect those she loves, but her pride and how she sees war is a lot different because of her experience. And it isn't until Selena is killed, fighting, taking the Ares cabin to help, that she realizes, she can't keep that view, forever. That war is like that. Because obviously they lost people during the Battle of Labyrinth. And we don't know how many were lost. We don't know if any Ares cabin kids were lost. They probably were. But it's just different during the Battle of Manhattan. Why I think Michael always kind of knew the war is a lot different. He was able to process that differently versus Clarice, who is probably struggling with the idea of war not being as honorable as she thought it was going to be. It's bloody. It's, horrific. You lose people. And that's how I at least view it. Because Michael is focused on the battle. He's not thinking about, what happened between him and Clarice. He is focused on the battle and protecting his cabin. And protecting those around him. He, in general, is just like, and he also acknowledges that, well, I probably shouldn't have called her those names. That probably didn't help and all that. He knows he can, obviously have some attitude. He's more aware of himself than Clarice is. And it's interesting to me, that comparison. And also, I mentioned the, tell Michael not to be a selfish jerk, that's perfect coming from you in the introduction. this comes back now, because here, he's doesn't care. He's not, really being hard. He's not taking the time to, call her names now. He's gotten that, frustration out and has decided, oh, doesn't matter, let's focus on the battle, when he's talking with Percy. So it's interesting to see that different characterization, and that he's just kind of like, he's aware of his surroundings a lot more. He's, very particular in how he plans, and he's precise. And it's very interesting, as, he's the son of Apollo. He is the successor of Lee Fletcher, who, died. And that's another thing. We don't know. Maybe Ares' kids did die in the Battle of Labyrinth. But Michael lost an older brother. He lost someone he likely very much looked up to. And he was the first head counselor to take up during war. Obviously, the Stoles took up after Luke left, but that was a different situation. That's a different trauma. Michael had to, burn his brother's shroud and body. He had to take up the second largest cabin at the time. That's a lot of pressure. And it's no figure he's not going to let Clarice just run over him. He lost a brother and probably maybe even more siblings. We don't know how many siblings any cabin might have lost. And obviously, Clarice, if she lost siblings, should understand. But the difference is, Michael likely had to try to heal them, try to save them. He has so much people he has to try to save that there's no telling. We see with Will too, is that there's a lot of death with being a healer. You see a lot of death. You see a lot of hurt and loss. And Michael Yu is at that front lines. He's, he trained Will, so he's in the medic, in the infirmary. And so it's interesting thinking about that in comparison. It's like the healer versus the fighter, is that, obviously Michael is a fighter, but he's a healer. And, he's had more blood on his hands probably than Clarice ever will. She, especially, fighting mostly monsters and stuff like that. So, it's my take on how he perceives it versus how Clarice perceives it. But, of course, then we go to the next part where we learn that Michael got gifts, like a gift from Apollo. And I want to talk about this because that means he's interacted with Apollo. Now, I know the trials of Apollo doesn't think about, like, any of his dead kids. I'm gonna put that in writing, because, like, I refuse to believe that he wouldn't think about his kids at all, his, past kids at all. This is a guy who notoriously is known for, crashing out when his kids die, or something happens to his kids. So, like, it does bother me that Brick didn't bring up any of the late Apollo cabins, especially because we know, and I'm going to kind of go into the future a bit here, and this is partly related with Apollo's connection with his kids. We know that in this battle, in Wilsonburg Bridge and Battle of Manhattan as a whole, that most of the Apollo cabin dies. Michael likely being one of them. I might live in denial, but yeah, Michael likely is dead, assumably. I'd be pleasantly surprised if they fix it. But, so, and not, a lot of people say, all but 3. Actually, there were more than 3, or at least if there weren't, at least 3 campers came after Battle of Manhattan. Because they're described as half a dozen by Piper when they are in the Lost Hero. So there's at least like 6 who survive. Maybe less, and some of them are new campers. But either way, at least, or at least at most, 6 survive during the Battle of Manhattan. And then 3 of those 6 also die, likely during the giant war. But the point is, like, Apollo, obviously, I do feel like even before cares about his kids. And I kind of do use this point, because there's a lot of people say, oh, he didn't care about his kids before being turmoil. But, like, Apollo is known to care about his kids in canon. You know, Will mentions him not, talking or even answering their prayers is not normal for him. And it seems like it's not they've been silent since after the war. It's at all kind of thing. So if it was new that it was picked up, I feel like he wouldn't be as surprised if it was a regular thing. So I guess that's why it is something when knowing Apollo interacted with Michael, it's kind of emotional to me. Because Michael, like, he's proud of it. He grins. It's very sweet to imagine how that interaction might have gone. Because most likely, this is after Lee dies. Like, Michael loses Lee, and assumingly Apollo talks to him at some point. And I could be wrong. It might not have anything to do with Lee. He might not even be brought up during their conversation. But it's kind of... He has, he's newer to the head counselor thing. So, assumably, Apollo might have reached out to him after Lee died. And that might be Apollo's way of trying to keep his son alive and not lose another one, only to lose most of his children again. I wish that was explored, because that would have been really interesting. We just have to use fix, I guess. Oh, great, I'm going to end up having... Okay. Well, I know what I'm going to end up writing later. Point is... It's a small thing, but it's something I think about a lot with Michael. Of how proud he is of it, too. Like, he interacted with his dad. He's maybe not close with him, but he talks with him, and likely somewhat regularly before this. I mean, I know, like, obviously other head counselors talk, get stuff from their parents, but I guess for Apollo Cabin, it's just different because they just talk about Apollo and interact with Apollo differently even before Trials of Apollo. But I just wanted to talk about that because it's such a small thing. But the fact that Apollo might have talked with Michael after Lee's death and gave him those arrows, just hoping to keep his son alive a little longer. Between that and the thing with Dionysus and Pollux, it's just, it hits emotionally. But afterwards, one thing too, when he talks about it, he says loud music can be bad for you. And I know it's just like, obviously he's talking about, it hurting the ears and stuff like that, but like, that's such a, like, medical pun to me. Loud music can be bad for you from the medic is very hilarious. But then him also gonna be like, unfortunately, it doesn't always kill. And I'm just like, oh, I love Michael's personality here. It is very fun how he is during the battle. And this is the most interaction we get. Like, people talk about his interaction with Clarice more, but most interaction we get of Michael is right here with Percy. And he's so funny. I love it. But, continuing on, Michael, of course, says, we have to fall back. I got Kayla and Austin setting traps further down the bridge. And I want to talk about this line on its own, specifically because we know now. Now, I don't know how planned, if, Rick even thought of their age before this. But we know now that Kayla and Austin are younger than Will. They're likely, I believe, Austin is a couple years younger than Will. He probably, let's say Will is 13. He's likely 11, maybe even 10 in this point. He's probably like around 11 at this point. He's young. Kayla is likely, we don't have a clear age for her, but she's likely 12 or 11, depending on if she's the same age as Austin or if she's between Will and Austin. And so he has them setting up traps further down the bridge. I assume that the bridge, when they mean like further down bridge, they mean like towards their side, so they can have traps when they retreat. I think, and if that's so, I want to talk about it because if we go with the idea of what we know with ages now for Kayla and Austin, it comes off, and it might not be intentional at this point, it comes off as Michael making sure that the youngest of, like, his cabin, his, siblings, are away from the line of fire. Now, could be wrong. Maybe it doesn't, isn't as lenient at all, but to have the youngest, because they're likely the youngest at this point, or two of the youngest, away from the battle and setting up traps when we see that others are still fighting, more on the front lines and stuff, it gives off that he is ensuring that the youngest of his cabin are safe. He's keeping them away from the, biggest of the fight and making sure they aren't, they're just, have something to do where they won't get as hurt, hopefully. That's my take from it. And I think about it a lot because it's just, again, Michael is such a protective character for his cabin. He protects their honor, he protects them as a whole. And I love it about him. And it comes off, too, when we get Will, who is protective, too. So, after Michael mentions Kayla and Austin, Percy tells him, "No," I said. "Bring your campers forward to this position and wait for my signal. We're going to drive the enemy back to Brooklyn." Michael laughed. "How do you plan to do that?" I drew my sword. And that's all he responds to that. He does kind of give some description. Actually, I'm going to finish this because Annabeth then goes on. "Percy," Annabeth said, "let me come with you." "Too dangerous," I said. "Besides, I need you to help Michael coordinate the defense line. I'll distract the monsters. You group up here. Move the sleeping mortals out of the way. Then you can start picking off monsters while I keep them focused on me. If anybody can do all that, you can." Michael snorted. "Thanks a lot." So, this seems very funny. Because, Michael... We see Michael versus Clarice that... Obviously, he's standing up against Clarice about the cherry and stuff like that. They're going back and forth. His first line is him, telling her she can kiss his quiver. It's very, also, back and forth in your face. versus like here where Percy just kind of like is kind of brushing him off. Not really. Like, he's, depending on him to do his part with, his cabin stuff. But he also, like, puts, it kind of implies that Annabeth can coordinate his cabin better. I don't think that's what Percy meant. And I think Michael knows that's technically not what Percy meant. But his little sarcastic thanks a lot, it's just funny. It's just also funny because this whole thing is Michael standing there while Percy flirts with Annabeth. Because, like, later on in the same scene, right after, he goes, "Don't I get a kiss for luck?" And it doesn't mention Michael reacting to this scene, because obviously Percy's focus is on Annabeth. But I'm just imagining he's, like, rolling his eyes in the back. I made a joke on Tumblr once that one of the last things Michael did before the fall was third wheel Percabeth, and he really does. But yeah, Percy just doesn't really give much of an answer to him. Like, Michael asks, how do you plan to drive the enemy back to Brooklyn? And Percy just draws his sword. He doesn't even give him an answer this time. Like, you get the back where Michael asks about the boats, and Percy just gives him an indirect answer. Just, lead me to it. And here, he doesn't even really respond. He gives somewhat of, like, when talking with Annabeth, he's like, here's the plan for y'all and all that. But he doesn't explain much. And, like, obviously too much detail. They're in the middle of the battle. They don't have time for detail. But it's still very funny because he doesn't even really give a concrete answer. And I assume, obviously, that Michael probably knows about Percy having a history with the Minotaur. If he, his age isn't really stated, but you can assume I always assume he's around Percy's age. About 15 or 16. He's at least 15, I feel like. I don't think he's really a young new head counselor. I feel like he's around Percy's age. But he likely, if he is around that age, there's a chance he was probably there around the time of the Lightning Thief. He could have came in later, but there's a huge chance that he was, he knows about Percy's history with the Minotaur. So he probably knows that's part of the plan for Percy. Why he doesn't, like, say much. He's just like, okay, I trust him. And that's a big thing. He goes back and forth with Clarice at the start, but with Percy, and every scene we have of him and Percy, because that's, like, mostly interactions we get of Michael, he has a lot of, trust in Percy as a, fellow head counselor and ally. I mean, obviously it's not, like, fully stated, but he trusts Percy's lead. And it's very interesting, because, like, you have, like, Clarice who struggles a lot with taking, orders from other people. That's something we see a lot. But with Michael, obviously, like, he makes sarcastic comments about it, but he follows Percy's lead. He was about to retreat here. He had a plan to retreat and everything. And instead, Percy is like, I have an idea to push them back to Brooklyn. And Michael follows his lead. And I find that interesting. One thing I wish we had more of is Michael and Percy interacting. Because I think they'd be interesting duo. They're just, I don't know. It's a small bit. I think a lot of it, too, is Percy interacts with Michael more than anyone else we see. Like, even more than Clarice interacts with Michael. So, it's like they seem to have a closer relationship, I say, mainly because they just interact more on the battlefield. I don't think we really see anyone interact with Michael outside of, uh, you know, during the head counselor meetings and obviously Clarice and Percy. I wish we did. Obviously, like, I personally like idea of like Michael and Jason being close, but or not Jason, Jake. But we just don't see Michael interact with many other people outside of Percy and Clarice, and I guess Annabeth too. We don't actually see. Yeah, we see like one small thing when she asks about the chariot, but other than that, we don't see them talk in the way, with actually, we don't even really see. I mean, we see more with Clarice, but like Percy is the main person Michael talks to in the book. But it's interesting compared to the small bits with Clarice, because that's why I base a lot of Michael's personality on. I feel like some base it more on his interactions with Clarice, but like to me, his interactions with Percy says a lot more. And especially because, like, we know he likely, obviously they worked close by during, after Michael takes over. And they probably had some interactions, before and outside of this. I don't really know. The series doesn't explore Percy's connections to other campers that much outside of, like, a few, which is mainly like obviously his kind of rivalry with Clarice and obviously Annabeth, and then Selena and Beckendorf a bit, mainly Beckendorf. So it's not much, and a little bit of the Stolls, but the Stolls are just everywhere. You can't escape the Stolls, especially Connor. Connor is everywhere. You'll see him no matter what book apparently, but I think that's why, like, I love his interactions with Michael, because it's just, Michael's only really been head counselor for maybe a little over a year. About a year. And I feel like it'd be interesting to see, like, especially with, we know Percy has, some feelings over the death of Lee for a bit. Like in, I think it's in the Sword of Hades, where he mentions that he's kind of like accepted Lee as, something that haunts him, his death, which also is interesting because we don't really know much about their, if they had any connection together. But yeah, I like to think, I like the idea of Michael and Percy being chaotic friends. I think Michael just was too much. If they were friends, that just be too much sass. I think that's the real reason that Michael had to go. No, it's just funny to say that, but yeah, I'll go into a little more, but I think it's kind of funny here where Michael is just, letting Percy take the reins. And I think that's interesting for his character again versus like Clarice, who it struggles to let anyone else take the reins. But yeah. So, after this, Percy then goes and defeats the Minotaur, and once the Minotaur is defeated, he charges, into the rest of the Monster Hunt army. At one point, he, acknowledges that the Apollo campers were behind him, and he mentions, "I followed with the Apollo campers at my heels." "Yes," yelled Michael Yu, "that's what I'm talking about." And mentions he drove them back to the Brooklyn side of the bridge. Annabeth tells Percy that they need to pull back, and Percy doesn't pull back immediately until they see Kronos. Annabeth and the Apollo campers faltered, and Kronos comes up, and then Percy says to pull back. The rest of the army charge, and Percy tells them retreat, and that he'll hold them. And mentions, and here I want to mention, Michael and his archers tried to retreat, but Annabeth stayed beside me, fighting with her knife and mirrored shield, so we slowly backed up the bridge. So I want to mention here, because Michael is seen retreating at this point. He's retreating with the rest of his cabin. He's likely, pushing them on towards, back towards their side of the bridge. So, why him and Annabeth are fighting, Percy sees Michael was retreating. After this, Annabeth gets hurt, and she's whisked away. By Blackjack. Here, Kronos comes up, and Kronos snarled, "Someday soon, I'm gonna make Pegasus do." But in the meantime, he dismounted, his scythe glistened in the dawn light. "I'll sell for another dead demigod." Now, I know he's talking about Percy right here, but I'll bring this up later in the passage. But him and immediately Kronos starts fighting with Percy, and he struck the bridge with the butt of his scythe. A wave of pure force blasted me backward. Cars went careening. Demigods, even Luke's own men, were blown off the edge of the bridge. Suspension cords whipped around, and I skidded halfway back to Manhattan. And so Percy gets knocked around. Demigods, including of course more Apollo kids, kind of get blown off. I do want to mention the Luke's own men. I think about that a lot, because I don't think anyone really brings up the fact that Kronos kills Titan Army demigods here. And I think the Wilsonburg Bridge battle is bloody in a sense of just how many demigods likely died here. Because obviously we know a lot of Apollo kids died. And I think most of the Apollo kids died at Wilsonburg. Obviously I don't think all of them died at Wilsonburg. Just most of them took the hit here. So I just reading through the fight and stuff, it's just interesting in context. If this is just the Apollo cabinet as a whole, and obviously Michael sees this, and then we get right after this, I got unsteadily to my feet. The remaining Apollo campers had almost made it to the end of the bridge, except for Michael Yu, who was perched on one of the suspension cables a few yards away from me. His last arrow was notched in his bow. "Michael, go!" I screamed. "Percy, the bridge!" he called. "It's already weak." At first I didn't understand, then I looked down and saw fissures in the pavement. Patches of the road was half melted from Greek fire. The bridge had taken a beating from Kronos' blast and the exploding arrows. "Break it!" Michael yelled. "Use your powers!" So, of course, this is where, Michael obviously tells the plan to break the bridge. And to me, again, it's interesting because, Michael clearly stops or comes back. Either he stops and just, perches himself on the cables mid-retreat, or he comes back to help Percy. It could be either because, it mentions that the blast knocked Percy pretty far up the bridge, or like halfway, it says, back to Manhattan. And so, like, it could be that he sees this and he immediately perches himself on the cables. Or he's already there waiting for the rest of his siblings to retreat. And he's, like, holding the line. Either way, it's clear that he's, either he's staying back for his siblings or he was all, came back for Percy. And I don't know. It's just, again, a small thing that might not even be intentional and I'm just looking into. But I feel like Michael is... I feel like he has a loyalty in a way that's similar to Percy, but like I mentioned, him being protective. And I feel like he's, willing to stay. He's willing to, ignore Percy's orders to flee. And like I mentioned earlier, he has a trust in Percy. So he, trusts Percy to fight, but he also knows Percy can't do it all on his own. Even like seeing, it says that Percy took, the first army of 200 down to like 50. So like he's seen, obviously part of that was also the Apollo cabin and Annabeth, but he's seen that Percy is pretty invincible right now. But even then, he still, stays and tells him. And part of that, I think he knows he has to keep Kronos from coming through for his siblings and for the rest of his peers. And it's just, it shows kind of his mindset. And I also think it's interesting because there's not a lot of like characters outside of like Annabeth, I feel like, that talk about Percy's powers, at least in the first arc. I could be misremembering, but I feel like his powers just, being used for battle. I mean, it's used, but not as like often in this way. I think the best example I can remember outside of this is him blowing up the mountain during Battle of the Labyrinth in the previous book. But I think in most cases he's not always using like his powers in that way, or like there's not many times where it's part of a plan. So I think it's interesting him using his or Michael telling Percy use his powers. And it shows like he knows, obviously, Percy's abilities. And it makes me feel like he probably is aware of all the abilities of his fellow campers. At least to some extent. I mean, he might not, but it feels like he could. In the sense, like, he... obviously, when Percy mentions the boats, he doesn't question it, or doesn't push. Like, he's confused, but he doesn't push when he sees Percy has a plan. And if he knows, obviously, he knows his powers enough to know or trust Percy to break a whole bridge. And by the way, like, the Wilsonburg Bridge, I don't know if y'all ever seen it. It's like, it's not like a walking bridge. It's it's built for multiple cars driving, to and from Manhattan. It has a walkway, and I think it has like, or maybe like towards the end or something where like buses stop. Maybe I have to look back, but it has like a walkway at least. Like it's supposed to be a pretty sturdy bridge. It's not like whenever I first read it, I kind of imagined the typical like just flat car bridge where it's just lanes, but the lanes are separated in a way you can't fully see the other side. of like the lanes coming. Like if you're going to, and I've never been to New York, so I don't know. I'm just saying from what I've seen, looking it up. So like it's a sturdy bridge, and I'm assuming like at this point, you know, I don't really know the full battle plan or like where everyone's at. It's kind of hard to sense it, but yeah, it's like it's a pretty sturdy bridge. So the fact that Michael has the faith in Percy for his powers to be, you know, powerful enough to just, you know, break the bridge. I mean, obviously it's weakened, but like still, I think he even mentions later that the cables are still kind of attached. So it's, you know, obviously he breaks the more solid parts and whatnot. But yeah, that's just Percy, or Michael having a lot of faith in Percy's abilities and seeming to be aware of them pretty well. It's just interesting to me. And also, you know, takes into account too. I mean, obviously, he is a healer, so also makes me feel like he probably knows abilities to prepare for also what they can, you know, the energy use and stuff like that. In the same way, like Will is with Nico, where he knows Nico's limits. I feel like Michael tries to, he might, it's not confirmed or anything, it's just more of like a small theory that Michael might be, where he tries to just acknowledge, you know, weaknesses in that case, so he knows how to, you know, take care of his fellow campers. I mean, again, he's a medic, and knowing their limits is probably an important thing for him. But yeah. So, Percy then does as Michael says, and he stabs Riptide into the bridge. After that, the bridge obviously kind of breaks apart a 50-foot chasm. It's, yeah, 50 feet between, like, it's what breaks from the bridge. Afterwards, you know, vibrations died, everything kind of cools down. The Titan Lord studied the problem. He looked behind him at the rising sun, then smiled across the chasm. He raised his scythe in a mock salute. Until this evening, Jackson. He mounted his horse, whirled around, and galloped back to Brooklyn, followed by his warriors. I turned to thank Michael Yu, but the words died in my throat. 20 feet away, a boat lay in the street. Its owner was nowhere to be seen. So, of course, here is where Michael falls. We don't know his fate after this, by the way. It's it's not mentioned. Actually, Percy only thinks of Michael once after this chapter. I'm upset about it. I'm still upset about that every time I think about that, because it's like, especially his reaction. But the reason I read that, you know, only in this part, is because of, I guess, going back to when Kronos said after Annabeth was whisked away, I'd settle for another dead demigod. And I know he was talking about Percy, I'm pretty sure, in that case. But here he looks, you know, at the rising sun, and then he looks across where he likely sees that Michael's not there anymore. You know, he can see behind Percy when, you know, Percy's focus on ahead of him. So he probably knows Michael's missing, that he's not, you know, on the cables. I don't know if he'd be able to see the bow or not. It says it's 20 feet away from Percy, and it depends on the position that Kronos is in, if he could see with the angles and stuff. Sometimes, like, when things are flat on the floor and you're at a different angle, you might not be able to see it. There's a chance he might not see the bow, but there's also a chance he probably does. Either way, he knows, I'm sure he can tell Michael's not there. And that is a 130-foot drop into the river. So, and I'm sure there's a very quick assumption that there's a high chance that Michael's dead. I mean, again, it's not, especially to the characters, it's not confirmed at that point. But you could easily say, yeah, I, was planning on taking Percy, but I'll settle for that dead demigod. And also, him looking at the rising sun, the fact that Michael, a son of Apollo, the god of the sun, falls as the sun rises. Like because it's just like, it's emotional to me, I guess. And also, at the same time, too, Michael rises to his role as the sun's rising. So, it isn't the sun, rising sun. It's just, again, I don't know if it is intentional. There's some of the stuff where I'm like, I don't know if this is intentional. The same with, like, the, I'll sell for another dead demigod, and then him smiling across the chasm. I don't know if it's intentional that he does, because Kronos is aware how close Percy is to his fellow camp. He cares a lot about, obviously his hometown and about camp. And Kronos is aware. So I'm sure he's like, well, I didn't get wanted per se, but I did do some damage. Because also, he took a big, the Apollo cabin overall took a big hit. That's a lot of dead demigods, most likely. Because it's just, man. So, after Percy turns and sees that Michael's not there. No! I searched the wreckage on the side of the bridge. I stared down at the river. Nothing. I yelled in anger and frustration. The sound carried forever in the morning stillness. I was about to whistle for Blackjack to help me search when my mom's phone rang. The LCD display said it had a call from Finkelstein and Associates. Probably a demigod calling on a borrowed phone. So, of course, this is where Selena calls about Annabeth. But this small part where Percy reacts to it, where, like, it mentions his, he yells in anger and frustration, and it carries. I pretty much see him, he's screaming probably over from the bridge, either from where he's looking over at the chasm or to the side or whatever. And it gives a feeling that he's, obviously he's distraught. And it's one of my favorite, like, kind of scenes, too, here, is because Percy isn't emotional over this. And it makes me frustrated because we then drop Michael. But, oh, God. Pardon the pun, but we drop Michael after this. Both literally and physically, apparently, because he is only mentioned one time after this chapter, and it's in a list of demigods that Percy is thinking about when he's up at Olympus. They offer him immortality, and instead he's like, pay your, freaking child support. He thinks about Michael Yu. There's also, like, a moment of he's not actively thinking about it, but there's some moments where you're like, okay, maybe he is, but not naming him. Specifically, there is a scene later on where Percy is up on Olympus walking through, and he mentions seeing a unmarked burial shroud. That's specifically Apollo burial shroud. There's some theories that might be Michael, but there's no confirmation, I don't think, and it could be anyone. And also, this is like a couple days. This is towards the end of the Battle of Manhattan. So obviously, it could be they found his body and stuff, but I feel like if they should have mentioned whether or not they found him or not, because it's and obviously he's not the only one who dies or is missing in action, pretty much presumed dead but no body, because there's a lot of Apollo kids who probably also were they were knocked off. The same with when they during that blast during the battle with Kronos. So there's a lot of likely a lot of the Apollo kids are at the bottom of that river. Oh, it's just, I wish it was brought up more. I think, especially into Heroes of Olympus and stuff like that, it could have been used for mentioning stuff like that and exploring that, because he was only head counselor for a year, and he's gone. He risked his life he took a final stand. One thing I get ticked off about is people, and they do this with a lot of characters, specifically Bianca too, trying to kind of undermining their choice and their sacrifice and their deaths. Bianca makes the choice, the plan. She did. And Michael chooses to be there by Percy's side. That's a choice he actively makes. And, it's not, oh, Percy is the reason he's dead. No. A lot of people talk about the idea of Will blaming Percy, and it's yeah, Will is young. He was also trained by Michael. He knows Michael probably better than anyone else, especially better than Percy. He's not likely, I feel to blame Percy, because he knows Michael. Likely the last thing Michael said to him was to keep going, because mentioned before, Michael was either standing on those cables, being the last resort to, take out anyone who tried to cross the bridge, or he was going back for Percy. Either way, he went in there knowing he was probably not going to make it out. He had one arrow left. One arrow. You don't go with your last arrow expecting to come out if anything goes down. He knew a chance of him dying was likely. Most likely, yeah. So, the idea that Will wasn't aware of his brother's mindset is so weird to me. Obviously he's shattered by Michael's death, but he's also a trained field medic who's seen a battle before, probably multiple battles, since we know there's been skirmishes and stuff back and forth since the Battle of Labyrinth. So he's likely seen he knows his role, and he likely goes into that. So I refuse to believe that Will would be, he might be conflicted, but I don't think he'd be angry at Percy. This is not a 10-year-old Nico here. This is a, like, 13-year-old Will. So, obviously we kind of reached the end of his, like, active scenes. After this, most of his two mentions, actually, after this chapter is them saying, Percy getting the rest of the Apollo cabin to keep looking for him when he grabs Will, and then the back on Olympus when he's thinking of a list of people. His burial shroud is not mentioned. Like, we don't hear see Will burning his shroud or anything like that. We don't really get anything after this. I think there's a point in House of Hades where he's again mentioned among the perceived dead. Whether or not his body was found, not known. Whether or not he's actually dead, he's most likely dead. But you can probably live in denial, and you can't be proven wrong or right at this point. Because he can be presumed dead and not dead. But he's likely dead. Because we are not told much about that. But he does show up, or he has some mentions in The Sun and the Star. Nico dreams of him for some reason. That it's a weird thing. I don't know why. They choose Michael other than, oh hey, this is a Will thing. But even then, it's like a lot of people mention, oh, he's not, or not a lot of people, but I know someone mentioned, oh well, he's, they don't actively say he's Will's brother. Why don't they bring up he's Will's brother? The implication is heavy. Like, obviously they don't straight up say, oh, that is Will's brother. But when he's seen in the dream, being talked through, I think it's Nyx who's doing the dreams. When Nico sees Michael in this dream, he sees Will across the bridge. And then the next time he is brought up, again, it's on Will, who mentions he was learning under Michael. And yeah, they don't outright say, yeah, that's, my brother, but obviously Will doesn't want to talk about it. He's still traumatized. He's still mourning. Like, it's clear it hurts to think about still. And, this has been like a couple years, a year or two. But it's clear, like, he still is struggling to get over what happened to Michael. But even though they don't outright say, yeah, that is his brother, the implications are clear enough that he likely was a child of Apollo. Because he was also a medic. And those two main scenes, his connection was with Will. So clear in your face. It's hard to say he's not someone connected to Will at that point. Okay, hey, Editor Payne here, just jumping in to talk about, like, a specific part, obviously Michael's part in this nightmare. Because it's, like, it's very small. But I want to talk about it because, like, this, like, half a page at the, like, page 25, where we get Michael, is, the first sentence is Will, looking so much younger and so terrified. Nico froze, trapped between the lines of battle. The bridge swayed beneath him. And it I guess makes me wonder if, like, and going on for it, this isn't real, Nico told himself. I'm not here. Listen, Percy stepped forward, forcing Nico back in Kronos' direction. Percy, what is this? He held his hands defensively. What are you doing? You have to listen, said Michael Yu, his intense brown eyes brimming with tears. If you don't, you will share my fate. So, this part with, like, Michael Yu of you will share my fate, I'm sure people have talked about it before of like how kind of weird it is, but at least I know I know it's kind of weird to me. Like, what does that mean? Because I wonder if it's not specifically about his death, because I mean, it because like if I think at the end of all these nightmares is them going, you have to fix a mistake, and if that's what they're trying to tell, why say you would share my fate? Because Michael's thing is he did go towards person, like his whole thing isn't he stopped retreating and then he went back. So it's very weird to say you would share my same fate. So it makes me wonder, like, okay, what is the point of this part? I mean, obviously there's Kronos and there's Percy pushing him towards Kronos for some reason. But, like, I have a tiny bit of theory, or like a small analyzation, I don't know what you consider it, that maybe this part somewhat is putting Nico in a weird perspective of what might have been Michael's view at the time. Obviously Michael's still there, but it gives him, I guess, like a weird feeling of it, because Nico's there with Percy, and then Kronos, who is partly to blame for what happened with Michael. So, and then there's Will, who, who's obviously much younger because of the situation. I don't know, it says looking so much younger and so terrified. Now, obviously terrified and younger makes sense, but so much younger? So I wonder, like, is Nico seeing him as younger and that he was the age he was at the time? Because, like, I mean, he was, like, 13 at this time? So, I mean, he wouldn't, I guess he'd be, like, 2-3 years younger. I guess you consider that so much younger, especially, like, with how, you mature physically and all that. But also, could it be he looks so much younger, terrified, like he's really young? And, of course, Michael's going to see his little brother and the fact that he's scared of the situation, and he's, going to end up, he's facing Kronos, and he ends up dying from that. So part of me wonders if this part is like, the fate isn't dying in general, but dying and leaving behind Will, and obviously, Kayla and Austin. But, like, Will specifically, because Nico knows how it affected Will in some way. Maybe not as much, but he's very much aware of Will's grief. So, in here, it makes me wonder if it's getting that somewhat perception of Michael being, having to leave behind someone, and later on it's like, the idea that they might have to leave behind someone is brought up, and Will and Nico are like, we're not leaving each other behind. And especially for, like, I think Nico especially, and obviously Will is scared of the idea Nico's gonna try to say if they have to leave someone behind, or like the idea Nico's scared he's gonna have to leave Will behind. And I wondered that's what this section is more so leading to, of Nico scared of having to leave Will behind, both not wanting to lose Will, but also, about Will losing him in a way of not again, losing someone else, and same way in lost Michael, and it's like, because Michael, his eyes are burning, he's crying in this. And if you think about, like, Michael right before his death, is that his siblings are retreating. They've, like, pretty much got to the end of the bridge. And he's, standing there. Him and Percy are, like, between lines, technically. Because they're between, the rest of the Apollo cabin and Kronos. They're the last, like, between those lines. And, Michael is probably seeing his little siblings terrified, and he's, leaving them behind and stuff like that, and how hard the idea of leaving Will with that could have been, because he lost Lee. He knows that grief, and probably knows how Will took Lee's death, even though it's never mentioned. But, so, the idea of him crying because of the fact that he had to leave Will and Caitlin Austin behind is an, I guess, interesting take of that I'm thinking about. And I just wanted to bring up. That being said, Michael canonically cries in this book. It might not be the real Michael, but he cries. And I'm emotional about it. Anyway, back to the rest of it. Wish there was more of him. Just overall. There's just not much of him in the series. And obviously he's a minor character, but he's a minor character that had a big role in the battle. And you would think after, like, what happens, how Percy reacts, he would be thinking about Michael more. And I wish there was the case. I think it would have been interesting to have that kind of, obviously Percy coming to accept it the same way he kind of did with Lee. And with Lee, obviously it's in a short story, him being like, yeah, I've, came to peace with those deaths and, the war and whatnot. But outside of that list of things in the House of Hades, there's not a detailed feeling of how Michael's, death affected him. And it could have been very interesting. It's the same with Annabeth, too, honestly. Because Annabeth is whisked away. She is, I don't know how much she's kept in the loop when, obviously, she's hurt. She's kind of dying at that point. So, and we don't see her learning about Michael's death. We don't see Clarice's reaction. And that's another thing, too. A big point of Michael's character was his interactions, or, like, his conflict with Clarice. And it's not resolved. Like, it's technically resolved between books. Because between the ending of The Last Olympian and The Lost Hero, the Apollo cabin gets the chariot back. We don't know how. We don't know what the interactions between Will and Clarice and everything about Michael's, death or whatever. It's just, oh, well, they had it, maybe. They don't anymore because it's destroyed. Annabeth promised to fix it, and they did not. Yeah, it's just, he has such, like, it's a character you could definitely play around with interactions. He has somewhat of a touch on at least 3 different semi-prominent characters. Like, Clarice, obviously, because like mentioned, the whole tell Michael not to be a selfish jerk, and her also when she leaves in a huff during that meeting says, "Have fun dying." Yeah, that happens. The whole, like, thing between Clarice and Michael is just brushed under the rug after this. And it shouldn't happen. But in a more conclusive, I guess, Michael, to me, is a character who is obviously has a lot of attitude, but a lot of, like, small bits of more complex personality, obviously, if you're like me and overanalyze every single thing about it. And he makes for an interesting character, and especially, like Lee, he comes in to die. He has more scenes than Lee, I feel like, but obviously he's more descriptive than Lee. Lee doesn't have a canon appearance. A lot of people want to say he's canonically looks like Will. He does not. There's no canon of him looking like Will. He's just no description. There's no canon age. There's just the fact that he is Lee Fletcher in charge of the Apollo cabin, and he dies. We see his burial shroud is described. That's another thing. Michael's burial shroud is not described. It's not at all. Lee Fletcher, who has less description and detailed part, he's not that influence. Like, he's there, obviously. I love Lee Fletcher, but compared to Michael, he doesn't have the same influence on the story. And so it's kind of like, dang, that Michael doesn't have a canonical description for his burial shroud. Another thing I do want to bring up is the thing with that Michael's death. Obviously, it wasn't completely on, Selena being a spy. But it caused the actions for Michael to have to make that heroic choice. I'm not going to say it's fully on the spy, but a lot of it is, a kind of effect of the fact that Selena obviously told Kronos about where everyone was going to be at. Actually, let me see, because there actually is a point where they're talking. Here. Jake Mason cleared his throat. He had been standing there so silently, I almost forgotten he was in the room. Percy. Something else, he said. The way Kronos showed up on the Wilsonburg Bridge, like he knew you were going to be there, and he shifted his forces to our weakest points. As soon as we deployed, he changed tactics. He barely touched the Lincoln Tunnel, where the hunters were strong. He went for our weakest spots, like he knew. Like he had inside information, I said. The spy. So, here, it's confirmed that, like, it feels like it's very much confirmed. Kronos knew. Like, he knew where everyone's at. And Jake Mason, Jake Mason says outright, he went for our weakest spots. And it's just, well, the Apollo cabin was the second largest cabin. So, and not only that, they were likely the strongest points because, if I remember correctly, going back, the Stoles were split. The Hermes cabin was split to 2 bridges, I'm pretty sure. So, I think they were close together, but they split up the Hermes cabin. Obviously, they were big enough. So, there's a chance that the Apollo cabin, next to, like, the Hunters of Artemis, were the biggest force at their respective spot. So why would they be considered the weakest? And it could be that Jake was specifying like some of the other cabins, but like we're talking about where we just had a big battle at the Wilsonburg Bridge where Kronos was. He was waiting there and facing Percy and all that. And the fact that, like, obviously the Minotaur was there and stuff like that, I genuinely think Kronos planned to attack the Wilsonburg Bridge specifically for a purpose. Like, it was intentional to attack the Apollo cabin. And one, technically, yeah, weakest would make sense. Not like weakest, technically, like in a complete sense, but like how strong they're going to be fighting. Because it's nighttime when they are fighting most of the battle. Like, most of the fight is at night. That means that the Apollo cabin are at their weakest. They don't have the sun with them. They're at their most weak. And they're fighting, 200 army of monsters before, like, facing Kronos is our main army. So, technically, yeah, they're weaker compared to the Hunters of Artemis, who likely are strongest at night. They have the most, experience in the night because their patron is the goddess of the moon. So, it feels intentional, the idea that Kronos targeted the Apollo cabin. For one, them not being at their strongest at night. And two, they are the healers. You take out the healers, you make it harder for the rest of the army to survive. So, it is, I feel, intentional. Because not only are you taking out most of the healers, you're also taking out most of the archers. And of course you have like the Hunters of Artemis, but they're strongest at night, most likely. So take out those who are weakest at night. You have an easier time next time you attack. And the thing is, yeah, they almost had it. It took like the Quran returning, I believe, to disrupt them to make sure, they didn't get through. Because they got close the next fight. They got close. So, the Apollo cabin getting taken out, like the way it was, affected the battle greatly. And it was partly due to Kronos learning from Selena. And it's just interesting because, again, like, there's Michael who brings, he's the first to react when Percy brings out the spy at the beginning of the book. He is also the one, kind of similar to, similar to how in the Battle of the Labyrinth, Lee is the first to say, we need to set up a defense. And then dies in that defense. Michael is the first one, is the one to go, we need to find this spy before we set up our next plan. And because of the spy, pretty much, it goes into what causes his death. It's not directly, but it's like, it's a big part of why he had to make the choices he did that led to his death or, disappearance and stuff like that. So, the comparisons are just, it's heart-wrenching. Because there's so much into it. And I also, like, Michael is just, I wish there was more of him, and he's such an interesting character. I also, after this, of course, like, after the chapter at Wilsonburg Bridge, we get Will saving Annabeth. And there's not mention of Michael. As I mentioned before, he's not, like, talked about by the other head counselors. We don't even see Annabeth learning about it. Most we get is Jacob Mason, maybe? Probably not intentional, but I am grasping at straws, and like that scene I read, he was so quiet, Percy didn't even notice him. Jake Mason is another character I can talk about. I'm not getting onto this here, but considering that Jake, you know, just became head counselor because he lost an older brother, and likely is, if, I mean, there's a chance that he's around the same age as Percy and Michael, likely too. There's a chance he might have known Michael. And especially since they have, like, you know, Michael lost Lee, he's most likely to understand Jason's struggle, so there's gonna be a chance there. Probably not. I'm just looking too deeply into things, but, you know, if you're not looking too deeply into things, what's the point? What's the fun in not? But, so yeah, there's not much, you know, reaction to it. Will is completely focused on, you know, getting there. I know people joke about, oh, Percy on the bicycle was Will's, you know, awakening. No, that boy was focused on the fact he had an injured Annabeth who was dying. And he was, like, pushing himself, too, because he, like, notably is pale after he heals Annabeth. So it's, overall, it's, you know, no one outright mentions it. You can kind of feel the tension of it, but you kind of have to look deeply into it to feel that loss after the chapter with Lois and Burbridge. So, yeah. I guess that's pretty much Michael's character to me. He's someone who's protective. He's obviously, he has a lot of attitude, but he knows when to cool it. For the most part. I mean, obviously there's moments like with him dive bombing an Ares camper and stuff like that. But overall, he's a character who rose up to lead. You know, just a year prior, he's the first one to lose their, you know, predecessor from death. I mean, obviously, like, they lose Castor too, but Castor and Pollux are, like, you know, Connor and Travis. They worked together, most likely. So, Michael, you know, he loses his brother. He's a medic, and he has a lot to take care of, and he dies protecting, you know, Manhattan and, you know, helping Percy. And the fact that there's not really a reaction from Clarice is sad, because it's like, again, you have where Clarice was refused to leave until Selena, you know, took that Selena took her armor and she left with the Ares cabin without her, and it took that before Clarice could, you know, stop just hanging around back at camp. And a lot of her fighting, like her fighting after that, it was for selfish reasons. And it makes it interesting because her, you know, again, telling Michael not to be selfish jerk, but he's the one who's went to battle. He's the one who lets her have the chariot. He doesn't care anymore. And it makes, like, Clarice an interesting character, and I wish we gotten that reaction, because Clarice needs that emotional reaction. You know, she's an interesting character herself, and to have that, you know, obviously she grieves for Selena and all that, but we don't see her reacting to about Michael, and we just get, like, the fact that she gave the chariot back at some point. Either that, like, I mean, most likely without being asked. I don't think Will cared enough to ask for the chariot back. I don't think he had other issues to deal with. But We also get like that one scene in Blood of Olympus where Will's the one to be able to calm Clarice down. So they have, like, at least she has some respect for Will and is able to, doesn't mind him calming her down and all that. It's just an intriguing thing. It's also intriguing too in that, because like we also see, she has neutral relationship with Lee. She doesn't fight with him. She's not like close with him, but they team up at least during the Battle of Labyrinth during those games. But yeah, I feel like Michael is a character I hope is explored more. We get hints of him. With the Sun and the Star, I think Michael and Lee should have been in that one nightmare, instead of Rachel and Meg. I love Rachel and Meg, but like if anyone's gonna make, really make Will feel bad, bring up his dead brothers. That's gonna make him feel worse in a nightmare. It could also have been like, start with Rachel and Meg and turn, to Michael and Lee. It's just, there's ways you could have added or mentioned Michael in more, descriptive ways. I mean, you could have added that to reasons some of, like, the veterans of the Titan War might be struggling, especially with, like, once Percy's gone, or, like, how that affects them in The Lost Hero and onwards and stuff like that. Like, Jake, again, bringing up Jake, he's so depressed in The Lost Hero, and, of course, it's, like, with the curse and being in a full body cast and the fact that he lost his brother. You could also add, he lost someone he was close to as well with Michael. And especially with like we see him really only interact with Will and his siblings. That could have been a good thing. You could rolled with that. But yeah, Michael is a character that's, not explored much as he could have been. But he's interesting when he's there. He's a very fun character. Because he's got that little attitude. And he's sassy, but he's also smart. And I love him. He's my favorite character. So yeah, this was me rambling pretty much. There was no script, just me, my ADHD, and Gatorade keeping me on. So yeah, I don't think I have really much else to say. Leave, I guess, any thoughts on Michael as a character or stuff you might have noticed about him and stuff in the comments. Really, I don't know how much traction I will get on this video. This is just for me. But yeah, hope you enjoyed. Have a good one.